Welcome to Acton Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Sam Gregg. Eric Cohen is out this week. Thanks for listening. I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate to the show notes for this episode to find a link to subscribe directly to Acton Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. This week, I'm joined by Dan Churchwell, who's the Director of Programs at the Acton Institute, as well as Dan Hugo, who's a librarian and research associate at Acton as well. So I hope you all had a good Memorial Day weekend, but we're going to talk about a subject which is less about remembering good things and much more focusing upon some of the difficulties that we experience, that any church experiences, any religion experiences, when politics enters the congregation. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because there was a very interesting article in The Atlantic, published on May 10th, 2020, by Tim Alberta. And it's really a discussion of politics and the evangelical church in the United States today. And to give you a sense of precisely what they're talking about, the title is How Politics Poisoned the Evangelical Church. Well, of course, religion and politics have gone hand in hand from the very moment that Jesus Christ said to some of his interlocutors, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." But Christians and people of other faiths have always had questions about how they should bring their faith into the public square, and how the public square and things that are going on in politics and everyday life, how that should affect what churches, mosques, synagogues talk about on a daily level. But we're going to be focusing very much upon American evangelicals this morning. So first of all, I'd like to turn to you, Dan. This article really suggests that something has changed with American evangelicalism. And at least from this article, it seems to be suggesting that this is in part of the, let's call it the Trump phenomenon, the emergence of Donald Trump into politics in 2015, becoming elected president at the end of 2016. And this threw many things up in the air. I mean, American evangelicals have been involved in politics for some time now. But it's interesting, I think, that this article talks very much about how the emergence of Donald Trump has affected, and at least it argues, the differing views about President Trump's agenda, but also the election of 2016 and the election of 2020 has introduced the types of divisions that at least the article argues weren't so apparent in the evangelical world in America before 2016. So I'm wondering, first of all, Dan Churchwell, what do you think of this article? And do you think it presents an accurate picture of what's going on in American evangelicalism? And if not, what do you think is going on vis-a-vis politics and evangelicals?
Yeah, it's a fascinating article. You know, it takes about an hour to read, and it's a really interesting analysis and just the narrative. I think he does a nice job contrasting the two different pastors, you know, from the Detroit area. But I'm not sure as I read it if I find it as amazing or as interesting as some people do in one regard, is that I think a lot of this issue comes from the problem with what do we even mean by evangelical? And so, you know, that classic defining the term when we're talking about it, whether you have David Bebbington's, you know, famous quadrilateral, that, you know, an evangelical is somebody who's interested in biblicism, a cross-centered relationship with Jesus, a conversionism, that there has to be a very clear conversion to Christ, a moment in time that you can point to, and then activism, That was David Bemington's four quadrants. And there's debate about whether this, but for years, this is what has stood as trying to help define evangelicalism. Well, those four pieces are a giant tent. And in that giant tent, you have very disparate theological understanding. And I think at the root here, even though it's about politics, the article itself, it stems from some of the messiness or the fragmentation by the definition. What does evangelical even mean? Because there's so many different denominations under that tent with different, especially the big theological term would be eschatology, right? The end times. A lot of these pastors and some of their parishioners don't even understand or realize that a lot of them are influenced by a certain kind of eschatology that makes them think that Christians are supposed to be doing some sort of action to usher in the kingdom or not. And
does that mean political activism, Dan Churchwell? Is that what you're speaking about there? Or are you talking more about the type of thing that Christians are expected to do as a consequence of choosing Christ? Yes.
So evangelism and those kinds of things are wrapped up in that. But no, social activism was, again, according to David Bemington, and again, this is kind of generally accepted as a good framing to start talking about what is an evangelical because it's so hard to define. But yes, social activism has always been a part. Dan Huger and I were talking earlier. I mean, there was an evangelist named Billy Sunday who was a famous Southern Baptist. Actually, he was a baseball star. An American baseball star who got saved and left the life of being a famous baseball player and became an evangelist around the turn of the 20th century. And in part, his preaching and engagement with politics helped bring in the 18th Amendment because they felt so strongly against drink, and alcohol. And so prohibition, he fought for this idea of prohibition. And so, I mean, we could go on and on and on about how, I mean, it's not new that evangelicals have engaged in political discussions, but I think at this moment that trying to decipher what did Trump do? What did Trumpism or never Trumpism? I mean, now you have people like David French and people taking sides. And what Alberta does in his piece, I think is really great, is showing now the guns, instead of the church, pointed outside, like fighting the world, they're actually fighting each other. Like the piece, the article, he's talking about the evangelical churches are now fighting each other more than merely fighting, quote unquote, the world.
So in that context, one of the quotations in the article, I think it's from Russell Moore, who was once was quite prominent with the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yep.
He makes a point in there. He says, I don't know any church that's not affected by this.
Yeah.
So do you think that that's an accurate depiction of what's happening in American evangelicalism at the moment, or is it something that's specific to particular denominations? Because you said, and I think this is very important, that what does the word evangelical even mean? Is it a sort of broad-based thing, or is it much more about something more doctrinal? So I guess I'm posing the question. So when he says this is something that's affecting the evangelical world as a whole, and there's really no church that has escaped this, is that accurate, or do you think that it's just particular parts of the evangelical world that this is affecting?
Well, I definitely think the more conservative you get, some of this is the concentration of it might be thicker, but even in, I mean, you see it in more progressive evangelical circles as well, just obviously from the other different sides. And so, no, I really do think it's very accurate. I was a professor in one of the largest Bible colleges for 6 years. And so I have a lot of students who have been all over the country who I still engage with, whether it's through social media or text or friendships, and they're all over the map. But I don't think there's a single one, like he stated in the article. I think it's very accurate that there are churches that they're really, I don't think you could point to a church that COVID/Trump, those two issues haven't been so ultimately politically engaged that has affected every, I think it's a very fair statement.
Well, let me turn to you, Dan Hugo. I know that you have followed closely the history of different Christian churches in the United States. So I'm wondering, how would you situate this article in the context of the history of evangelicals and politics since the 1970s? Because I could be completely wrong here, but my sense, and I'm speaking here as a Roman Catholic who's not familiar with the history of this, my sense was always that evangelicals, again, with all the caveats that Dan Churchwell mentioned, started engaging in politics really in the 1970s with movements like moral majority, etc. Now, I could be wrong there, but that's always been my sense. So, Dan Hugo, I'm wondering if you could situate some of the issues that this article talks about in the context of this longer history of evangelical engagement with the political world in the United States.
I think there's definitely a turn, and Dan is right to draw us back earlier to figures like Billy Sunday, folks in the late 19th, early 20th century. We could go back also to the Civil War and sort of activism, abolitionist activism within churches. We could go back to the very foundation of the Republic, where you have many ministers actively preaching to their congregations in favor of what was then sedition during the American Revolution. But there is something that happens after the Scopes trial, where a lot of these folks feel sort of publicly chastened.
Could you say something about that trial? Because many of our listeners may not have heard of it.
So Tennessee at the time, Tennessee had been teaching from a standard sort of scientific textbook that argued both for evolution and eugenics. And the legislature of Tennessee took exception to this, outlawed the teaching of evolution in schools. There was a teacher who continued to teach this, and thus there was a trial. This is a very famous trial, a very early, in which Williams Jennings Bryan argued on behalf of the state of Tennessee. He had been the sort of four-time Democratic Party presidential candidate in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, had been Secretary of State in the Wilson administration. And Clarence Darrow was the famous trial lawyer who argued on the other hand. The case caused a sort of public uproar. H.L. Mencken, the famous journalist, came to town and basically ridiculed the people of Tennessee for being a bunch of rubes. There was a very famous play, Inherit the Wind, based on this. And this sort of chastened that political activism. Or maybe another way to think about it is some of these early cases in the 20th century, let's say prohibition, let's say advocacy for America's entry into World War I, were Christian political advocacy, but they happened among both what we call the traditional mainline churches and what we would now sort of anachronistically call back the evangelical churches. The Scopes trial kind of signals the break with that. There was a historical project of sort of trying to reclaim the sort of social witness of evangelicals among Harold Ockenga, Billy Graham, these sort of folks. They founded Fuller University.
Yeah, this is 1950. Ish,
Yep.
that 50s.
Christianity Today magazine comes out of this. And so there's a slow rise in political engagement. Where this first shows up electorally, sort of counterintuitively, is with the Carter campaign for the Democratic nomination for president in 1976. Many evangelicals politically mobilized for the first time in a long time as a sort of self-conscious group in favor of President Carter's candidacy, because President Carter was famously an evangelical who was also famously forthright about his faith convictions. The Carter administration had many faults. Many folks ended up being unsatisfied with it for a whole constellation of reasons. And some of these folks began to mobilize as explicitly advocates or explicitly on the American right. And this is, Jerry Falwell, who comes out of a fundamentalist tradition, organizes the Moral Majority. And there are these flurry of groups throughout the 80s and 90s that are focused very much on sort of family values.
Culture warriors, that term, yeah.
All sorts
I assume issues like surrounding life issues, for example, were part of these. Okay.
So life issues are part of this. Education issues are part of this. Prayer in schools, the reintroduction of prayer in schools was an early sort of push. And that coalition stayed broadly intact. There were some folks more enthusiastic, some folks less enthusiastic. Through the Bush presidency, another sort of famously evangelical president, although United Methodist by actual membership, but sort of identified as an evangelical Christian, that coalition really starts to fracture with the Trump administration.
Well, Obama, too. I would say Obama created some of the foundational cracks that then blew apart.
Well, what's interesting about this is that the article does talk about Barack Obama as well as obviously President Trump. And as you say, Dan, the sort of catalyst that this provided within the evangelical church for some of these things to become more present. Now, I'm also reading here that in 2016, 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. I don't know what the percentage was for 2020. My suspicion is it was either the same or higher. Either of you, I'm sure, will correct me if I'm wrong about that. But, and this is really a question for Dan Churchwell. Evangelical Christians has for a long time gone together in the minds of many Americans, not all, but many Americans, with conservative politics. There's been this long-standing assumption for a while, at least say that since the Reagan administration, that evangelical means that you are most likely to be conservative in your politics, conservative in your economics, probably a reliable voter for the Republican Party. So my question to you, Dan, is this article and some of the tensions that it highlights in the evangelical community in the United States, do you see some of these tensions breaking up some of those easy associations that many people, especially outsiders like myself, have made about American evangelicals and conservative politics writ large?
Well, one thing I think it has done is it's glued. I mean, it's in the American psyche that religious people can sway or have direct effect. I guess the theater of politics can have such a great effect. I mean, whether we're talking about Billy Sunday or whether we're talking about, evangelicals have always been known to harness modern technologies. And so whether it's radio, when you move from the big tent evangelism, of the awakenings of the early 20th century to Billy Graham on the radio. And in fact, that late 1940s, post-World War II, early 50s, when you have all those new evangelical institutions, in fact, they rebranded as neo-evangelicalism. So there's the last 70 years has been kind of the rise of neo-evangelicalism, as Dan Huger mentioned, some of those institutions being created, like Christianity Today and a lot of schools of higher ed. So that I think the pivot point for us, or at least the concentration of the Trump issues with conservative evangelical voters, is the total embracing of the social media platform and the influence of some of the articles and people that they platformed that allowed some of these theories and ideas on political theological engagement to thrive. It really thrived because of the social media movement. That's why I said I love the article in its narrative, but there have always been these movements in broader evangelicalism, always. like all the way back to the founding, like Dan Huger said. So evangelicalism is kind of very fluid in how we describe it. In fact, a lot of churches are now, they call themselves non-denominational. So you go to an evangelical church, that means non-denom. So there's no denomination. So it's led by one pastor, one group of leaders. There's no hierarchy. So it's not like a Presbyterian or for sure a Catholic, where you have the layers of response. So they're assigned to themselves. So the pastor or pastors can act autonomously. And so in evangelicalism, broader evangelicalism, there's not a lot of oversight. And so a pastor can get up, like the article says, and have a political moment from the pulpit and do it every Sunday. And they said that's what the people loved. Tim Alberta said that's the more they polled the congregation loved the culture minute or whatever. I forget exactly what he called
it. Diatribe.
The diatribe. His crowd loved that. And the one church grew from 100 to now 1,500 in 2 years.
So you're suggesting that there's a type of incentive factor that's working here?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And when you bring in those cultural issues, people want, but tying it, how does that tie into a specific ecclesiology? Like, what is church for? What is it? And what is it, how I think those are really popular or not popularly talked about. The theological foundations of what's going on aren't understood well, especially in evangelical churches.
Let's talk a little bit about the social media side of things, because that's another thing that struck me about the article, just how many times social media was mentioned again and again and again. With the man who goes into the building and does a little video, and suddenly he's got 18 million people watching his video and therefore attracting lots of people to his particular group and his particular way of being church, etc. So Dan Huger, as Dan Churchill said, evangelicals have been masters of taking new forms of technology and using them in different ways to spread their message, to build up their congregations, not just to evangelize, obviously, but also as a way of establishing a place in the public square. What's different, however, Dan Huger, this is for you, what's different here about social media in particular? Is there something about social media in particular that seems to be driving these deep divisions and even a certain degree of vitriol within evangelical America when it comes to politics today?
I think that's absolutely true, and I think Dan is very right in pointing us towards the technological role. Evangelicalism has always had a very strong, what we call a parachurch, where you have these ministries independent of congregations, oftentimes always independent of denominations. These are the sort of things like Christianity Today magazine, Fuller Theological Seminary. A lot of these evangelical institutions founded in the 40s and the 50s were on this parachurch model. What social media has done is it's democratized that technology, where it no longer needs an institutional infrastructure. It can just be a pastor in a congregation. And you'll note the way the article is structured, which gives a sort of two sides of this sort of war on evangelicalism, is on the one hand, you have this pastor of Floodgate Church, this church that has grown dramatically because they did not shut down at all during COVID lockdowns, and because of some of the political commentary fiery political commentary delivered by the pastor. And the response is interesting because the other pastor in town, Pastor Brown, who is sort of queasy about these developments and uneasy with them, his response is to start a podcast discussing some sort of issues in the church, which is very striking to me. And so now, these movements can gain steam based merely on the sort of charismatic weight of an individual leveraged through social media. And then people are increasingly responding to these through social media. All of this occurs outside of the sort of both not only the denominational context, but also the parachurch contexts that have historically acted as sort of guardrails of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, that's actually a very interesting point, I think, because there are no guardrails, right, with social media in this context. And I think your point, Dan Churchwell, about the rise of these evangelical non-denominational churches means there's no hierarchy, right?
Right.
There's no elders
Right.
or anything like that can say, hey, Pastor Dan, knock off the politics, or Pastor Jill, we don't want you talking about these subjects because it strikes us that this is not consistent with the message of the gospel, etc.
Well, and the democratization of technology, like Dan Huger was saying, is apparent because at its core, at its definition, evangelicalism is a slippery term. So it's very fragmented in how you understand it. Well, when you get technology, particularly social media, embedded, which is hyper-fragmented, you have all of these affinity groups. So all of the fragments can now have their own platform. So even some of the ones that might have been more fringe evangelical, if you have some, quote-unquote influencer or somebody writing a lot of material, whether or not it's fallacious or not, you can create your own brand, and evangelicalism at its nature is brilliant at that. And so you have these smaller and smaller affinity groups create, so you can really find a church that just really zeroes in on all of your wants, and especially around the fracturing of Trump and COVID, the combo there, I think really augmented the ability of social media to be like the water that's in that stress crack in the rock, in the foundation, and just to blow it apart. And I can't stress enough that this article wasn't about the church versus the world. It was about the evangelical church versus the evangelical church. And so that fracturing is becoming more apparent.
Right. And I was going to add to that one of the other things that struck me about the article was the way in which people would just get up and leave when they were dissatisfied with what they were hearing, right? So there's the lady who describes herself as a moderate Democrat who simply gets tired of hearing what her pastor at a particular church is hearing. And then I think the expression is she goes shopping. Mm-hmm. She goes shopping. And that I thought was very interesting because I think that, as you say, social media and the way that has empowered individuals, but also generated this fragmentation, creates a circumstance in which that type of shopping, let's call it church shopping, denomination shopping, congregation shopping, simply becomes a lot easier. Well, of course, social media isn't the only way in which people of faith can engage in thinking about political, economic, cultural, and social issues. There's also think tanks like the Acton Institute, which have been doing this now for over 30 years. And that's why I'm very glad that Dan Churchwell is with us today, because I'd like to turn our discussion to another forum beyond social media, another forum that engages differences of ecclesiology, doctrine, dogma, but also differences about philosophy, politics, and especially, of course, economic questions. And that's what the Acton Institute does in many respects. But we have our premier event coming up very, very soon, Acton University, in the middle of June. Unfortunately, it's closed in the sense that it's fully booked. We can't accept any more applications for this. But I'm very glad Dan Churchwell is here today because I'd like to sort of talk with him a little bit more for our listeners about what Acton University is, why it's important, and its role in the overall work of the Institute as it goes forward. So, Dan, you're the person who's really the master behind the scenes for everything to do with Acton University. I was wondering if you could tell us what you think are some of the most salient things that would interest some of our listeners about Acton University and the type of gathering that it is.
Absolutely. What is so fascinating to me about Acton, we're an ecumenical think tank who deals with the intersection of religion and economics, connecting good intentions to sound economics, however you want to say it. We do great conferencing all over the country, internationally, and so we do really. And that's what I hated about COVID. We pivoted to a lot of online and we did amazing things. But when you're able to sit around a room and have conversation with some of the world's best thinkers on politics, economics, the intersection of faith work and economics, it really is a different thing. So, I'm just delighted that we're back in person this year. We host our, main conference right here in Grand Rapids. We're going to have about 750 to 800 people join us. And Acton University has been a part of Acton Institute for almost 20 years now, I think. And so it's steadily grown. We had about 1,100 people right before COVID shut in 2019. And so having 800 back, I think we're just absolutely delighted. This year it's going to be about 50% international. And
Wow.
so there really isn't another conference. And the University of Pennsylvania, right, consistently ranks us as the top or one of the top free market think tank conferences on these interdisciplinary topics because of we're having over 60 faculty members presenting 122 lectures throughout the 4 days. And again, we're ecumenical. So there are Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox. We have some great Muslim scholars coming and Jewish scholars to talk about religion, faith, and economics. And you can have lunch one day with a group from Peru, and dinner, you're sitting around with a group from Chad. And then the next day you're in session with somebody from Eastern Europe. And so you have the opportunity to rub shoulders with an diverse group of people thinking through what does it mean to live morally, ethically, religiously in a world that's embedded with economic and political decision making. And so I really can't talk more highly enough. And I know you said, I think you said I'm the man behind the curtain, but what a great team here. Dan Huger, he puts on great conferences through research and everybody steps up. But I am really excited to be back in person June 20th. And just one caveat, we are having an online component this year. So if you're unable to make it because of in person, but if you go to university.acton.org, you could still sign up for the online portion and just get a little taste of what it's like, and maybe join us next year in person.
So Dan Huger, Dan Churchwell's told us a lot about Acton University in a very short period of time, which I thought was excellent. But Dan Huger, I'd like to ask you this question. It's a question about the pedagogy, how the curriculum works. You've been watching this, you've been involved in shaping the curriculum at Acton University. How would you describe it as working and the sort of ends that it tries to serve?
So there are sort of two ways that it functions. So there are, as Dan was saying, the 60 speakers. But for folks who are new, there is a sort of core curriculum where we go through and we talk about sort of the vision of the human person, where we talk about basic economics, where we talk about natural law, these sorts of things. These get everybody sort of up to speed with the Acton synthesis and what we have tried to accomplish as an institute in undergirding sort of all of this with a broad foundation that then you can go out and explore the various topics. We have speakers on, an immensely wide range. So you get, it's sort of this, you see this in some sort of like liberal arts universities of like a very strong core curriculum that then enables, because this is not a model where you have someone get up and lecture at you the whole time. What this is a model where you get up, you hear people, great scholars with excellent perspectives, sometimes perspectives that disagree, but they help you to bring you into an ongoing conversation that you have first with the speakers, then with your fellow participants, and then hopefully then out into the world, into your own churches, communities. This is an ongoing dialogue about a free and virtuous society. This is not, Father Robert used to always say, there is no Acton Institute catechism where you have,
You sure about that?
There is a place in the world for rote responses to questions. Those are in churches when those things have been decided by ecclesial bodies. But this is a very diverse group of people that come together out of common concern and shared core principles. And that's what we want to facilitate through this. And this is really the event in the year where that all gets brought together along the widest range of topics, but also with the strongest emphasis on those foundations for those folks coming into it new.
And what is great is those lectures are 45 minutes each, but then we embed a 30-minute Q&A in every single lecture. And so you have direct access to these speakers and thinkers on these topics. So the people that sit in on the lectures can spend, it's not like a TED Talk, like you mentioned, where you just get talked at and then they bail. You have direct interaction, and it builds relationships, and that they carry out and then follow through into hallway conversations and conversations at lunch and dinner. And it really is a rich time of conversation around these topics.
Yes, I've literally been followed into the bathroom by students wanting to talk about some obscure point of natural law. They came up in a discussion following the Q&A of a particular lecture. I kid you not, that has literally happened to me. So Dan Churchwell, one of the things about Acton University, of course, is that we bring in several plenary speakers, and these are held in the evening. It's a point where everyone is in the same room at the same time. But we bring in plenary speakers, people who are coming from different disciplines, different types of backgrounds, but who are clearly major players in their particular area. So I'd like to conclude this session by you just telling us a little bit more about who some of the plenary speakers are and some of the topics they're going to be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have some really interesting people coming on Monday night. Dr. L. Gregory Jones, who's the new president of Belmont University and kind of an expert on entrepreneurial leadership. He'll be doing the Monday night plenary session. And again, these are going to be live streamed, and so people can join the online component as well. And he adds some really interesting, he was at Duke for many years and has really done a lot of research, and we're looking forward to have him here on talking about generally entrepreneurial leadership. Tuesday night is Amity Schlaze, and Amity Schlaze, the economic historian, many great books. She's going to be discussing some of her new work, and from a historical perspective, she does really interesting, her book, The Forgotten Man. Right. And
A Great Society,
yeah,
another book of hers.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's really an expert on kind of that era, and so she's going to update it and apply it roughly 100 years later. What does she see now going on that is applicable or even similar to what was going on during the history component that she is most versed in. Wednesday, we have Mike Cosper. Speaking of evangelicalism and fracturing, Mike Cosper is a producer and host of podcasts at Christianity Today. And last year, the main one they hosted was called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, based on a church in Seattle. And a pastor, a lead pastor, and it talks about technology and influence. I mean, it was one of the leading podcasts of the year of all podcasts. So Mike Cosper will be talking a little bit about some of his experiences there and what evangelicalism, what's going on there. And then finally, Thursday, Father Sirico and others are leading a panel on one of our great new documentaries. And it's called The Hong Konger. And The Hong Konger is about the fate of Jimmy Lai, the billionaire from Hong Kong, who has been imprisoned due to his stance on a lot of the political issues going on. And Acton Institute has published a great documentary now, created a great documentary, and we'll have a panel of people from that documentary speaking and engaging the final night with that. And we'll also have a special showing of the Hong Konger at Acton University. And so, we're delighted to have that diverse group for our plenary sessions.
So, Dan Huger, to close up with you, what's your best anecdote from Acton University?
Oh, my best anecdote involves a professor that shall not be named. And this is to give you an idea of that sort of immediacy. I was assisting with our bookshop. We always have a wonderful bookshop going on at the same time as Acton University, and was working with some interns and staffing that. So we came into one of these evening plenary sessions late. And as we arrive, we take our seats at like an empty table in the back of the room. And when dinner begins, and late, a professor, one of our speakers, comes and he goes, oh, I was told I could sit here. And then we're like, oh, welcome, and this is, a very august older man. And he just starts quietly eating. The wine service had already been by the table. And so then he takes his knife and bangs his glass and says, hey, can you turn this into wine for me? At which point I flag down some of the gracious staff at the DeVos place, and I get this august professor his wine, and he returns to his meal. And a participant at Acton University comes up, and he comes up to him and he says, august professor, I've read all your books. You've been such an influence on me. I'm so glad to meet you. And they engage pleasantries, and then he goes, august professor, what is the biggest difference between students today and students when you began teaching? And he puts down his knife and his fork, and he turns to the participant and he says, there is no difference. They're all just slaves to the zeitgeist of the age. And at this point, I do what you gentlemen are doing now, and I excuse myself because I cannot do it at the table. And that is my most iconic memory of Acton University.
Well, I'm sure between the three of us, we could come up with another 2 hours of anecdotes from Acton University, but we're going to have to call it a wrap there today. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to Acton Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for a link to where you can subscribe directly to Acton Unwind, or just search Acton Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcast. 5-star reviews only, please, so that more people can find this program. Thanks to Dan Churchwell, thanks to Dan Huger, for the Acton Institute and the absent Eric Cohn. I'm Sam Gregg. We'll see you next week.